Bismillahirrahmanirrahim. Thank you for joining us for another webinar. Um, hopefully, we'll get started soon. So just before we start, as usual, just going to go through a couple of introductions. So we start with the Quran, as we normally do. The verse I've chosen for today is talking about male and female. So we have in Surah Al-Layl, وَمَا خَلَقَ الذَّكَرَ وَلَا الْأُنثَى, by the creation of male and female. Inna sa'yakum lashatta, your pursuits are diverse. And we see in the Quran, we see male and female being very distinct. As the verse goes later on, that our experiences of male and female are also very, very distinct. And again, as we've said before, there's no concept of sexual orientation in the Quran, but there is a concept of sex or male and female. That's important for us to ponder in these times when there's a lot of confusion around sex, gender identity, and so on. So you may be joining in and you may not know what we do or what Strong Support is all about. The Strong Support is a peer support organization, primarily for Muslims who struggle with sexuality or gender conflict. We are actually open to everybody. So we've had people who've come from faith or non-faith backgrounds, because we realize that this is something which is sometimes difficult to get support on, or to get support on at least if you may want to be exploring opposite sex attractions or exploring gender congruence. And those areas sometimes aren't well covered by the existing healthcare, which may be in your area. We have free consultation, 30-minute call, which you can access, and that's free for everyone. We've had about 300 people who've accessed that service since we started. So we continue to support those across the globe. A key feature of our support is our support circles, and we have a variety of these. So we have on Thursdays and Sundays, we have the men's circle. On Sundays, we have the women's circle, and on late Sunday night, we have the parent circle, and as well, our perhaps most growing circle as well is the Arabic circle, which has sometimes two different circles depending on how many people are there. Then we also provide one-to-one coaching for people who perhaps want less of a group setting. And we do webinars which are completely free, open to absolutely anybody and everyone, like the one we're having today. So just a catch up. So a lot of you know that we're quite involved in the space on how the government kind of proceeds with some of the work that we're doing and how that's perceived. Now, some of you may know we wrote to the Minister of Equalities, and they promised us to say that freedom of speech, freedom of religion, and freedom of people choosing the path that they want wouldn't be affected. The latest development for people who have a keen eye, you will have seen that at present there is a parliamentary debate on Monday, 13th June, whether or not they would include transgender in the conversion therapy ban. Now, as we've said previously, the government hasn't provided a clear definition of what conversion therapy is. And we've stated previously that if it defines a coerced or forced attempt to change, and obviously, we'd support that, we'd be behind that. But if it was in the definition of any change or any movement which isn't adhering one ideology, then that obviously becomes problematic, because then we're putting ideology into law rather than letting people decide what they want to do, and upholding an autonomy of people. So this is something which is quite interesting. Like I say, the government is going back and forth on this. So we will see what the outcomes for that result is. But because we know that a lot of you have concerns about this legislation, and you have concerns on what constitutes this and what we could be doing collectively as a community, what we've arranged is a roundtable. So on 25th June, we have a roundtable which is open for anybody and everyone to join. We've actually asked for a variety of speakers to come in. So as you can see, so far we've got confirmed is Dr. Stuart Wayton, who is not of a faith background, but he still believes in upholding of freedom of choice for clients who want to see a different maybe outcome. We have Dr. Julie Maxwell, who is a pediatrician and as well has worked in this area within the Christian community to get ministers to sign. I think it was about 3,000 ministers which signed an opposition to a ban on conversion therapy. And then we have Dr. Sheikh Ramzi from the Oxford Islamic Information Center, who actually testified in front of the government's Women and Equalities Committee to how the ban would adversely affect Muslims who may be struggling with sexuality or gender conflict. So we hope to see that, and we hope to see you, inshallah, on 25th June. So one of the reasons why I was really wanting to do this webinar and or wanting to kind of see was the importance of stories. Now, for me, in my journey, it was really, really important to see how other people were and that I wasn't alone in the struggle. And as most of you know, within the Muslim community, sometimes there's a lot of cultural or other barriers that might be in place where people don't feel comfortable in sharing their experiences and so on. And so what we have done is we started this campaign for us to share our stories. And I'm so grateful that a number of you have written to us and that we're collating these, and we've put these across our social media, and you can see the impact already that sharing truth, sharing these people's truth is having. And really, it probably gives me finally a backseat where people think, oh, it's just Ali who's speaking on this and so on. And the stories put to light that there's so many people, so many people who are going through this, and that it isn't something that you have to do alone, or isn't something that you can't find support for. So thank you for the people who continue to submit. We are in the process of putting these on the website and on social media. You can go to strongsupport.co.uk/stories, and you can find the stories which are there. And as you can see, they are across the world that we are having the stories which are being reported from. We actually had someone, as you can see, from Australia, where they have a very vicious ban in Victoria, which basically bans any type of support on this. And you can see how damaging that has been for this particular individual. It's quite sad to kind of read the story there, and hopefully, we can touch upon that later. Now, for the point that you've all been waiting for, I'm so glad to have Elizabeth with us. As you all know, she's the co-founder of Change Movement, which is a brilliant Christian ministry, which shares, as we were saying, stories of so many men and women in coming out of LGBTQ. She's also been a consultant to pastors and Christian leaders who are trying to establish connections within the LGBTQ community and serving in their churches to navigate how to deal with Christians who are having sexual identity issues. She's married to her husband, Doug, and she is a pastor in Bethel Church in Redding, California. She holds a master's degree in theology, and she has a number of articles and essays which you can find on her website. This is a very interesting quote which I found that Elizabeth, in the early 20s, as you can see, while she was attending a Presbyterian church, was lesbian. So it was identified as lesbian. So between 2000 and 2003, she was perhaps in the other side. And this is, this is really good because it shows you, I think it shows you that it isn't us and them, it's just having a different point of view. And it's saying that people can have different points of view, and then there's an intersectionality between faith and sexuality. And, we aren't a monolith, and we aren't, people who just have one view, or if you're of a certain identity, then you just have to have one view. And I think that's really something, and it's, showing a change of heart and showing that people are free to kind of plan out something which feels right and which feels God-centric for them. So yes, and you can see more of that and Elizabeth's story on her website. As well as we've discussed, there are a number of essays on the website which you can have a look, which Elizabeth has. You can go to changemovement.com. That is the website. And there's so many stories. It's so beautiful. There's a compilation of a book as well, which is available, as well as different programs which are available for people who are there and they're struggling. As most of you know, there's I think almost 3,000 is it 3,000 members, which is amazing. And I would say that is probably one of the most popular online communities which is out there, which is, credit to the team for Change Movement, to having that safe space where people can share their stories. And then, yes, so without further ado, I hand over to Elizabeth.
Thank you. I'm so honored to be able to join you. It was such a pleasure to meet you in Hungary, and then to connect with you from here. So, and I'm always amazed when I meet people who have been on our Facebook group. It's exciting to see what's happening. Honestly, I think I can only imagine that as the rise of the LGBT movement grows, because at least in the United States, we follow statistically that it is growing exponentially. People are identifying as LGBTQ in droves, particularly if you're younger. And in the United States, there are pressures among young people to identify as LGBTQ. If you don't have a solid foundation in a Judeo-Christian faith that values the binary sexuality structure, then why not? Why not just identify as non-binary or bisexual and go any direction you wish? And so it's a huge and growing movement. And with that, I can only anticipate that more and more people are going to want to find an alternative. When you've gone into that world, it's very hard to come out of that world. In fact, as you mentioned earlier, it's becoming illegal to come out of that world, which is beyond imagination, really, for all of us. So I'm delighted to be here to share with you, and I feel honored to be invited. Thanks, Ali.
Thank you.
How would you like me to start?
Yeah, so I guess we're a big fan of change movement and the stories and like really the movement that you've created. And like you said, it's so important that people have the voice, and especially where there is unfortunately, a lot of political pressure, because like you said, we don't realize we're dealing with people's lives here. It isn't so much of, I believe in this political camp, or I'm on this side. We're dealing with people's lives where people are trying to find peace within themselves, kind of no matter which line you stand in, you can't really be opposed to that. And with the legislation which is coming in, certainly as we discussed in Victoria, which is a complete ban. I actually read something on Twitter the other day that someone shared to me, that a parent who was having anxiety that if her child who was 3 identified as transgender, that she wouldn't be able to do anything, and she would have to give her child for adoption if that were to happen, because the law would criminalize the parent coming in and saying, oh, you can't force your child not to identify as transgender. So, really scary stuff where we can see, a lot of people say that, oh, is it because you're anti-trans or you're anti-this? And it's not that. It's the fact that if you put a certain type of choice or a certain type of lifestyle, which people are free to go, but if you make that law and you say anybody who doesn't do this is, fined, and in Victoria the fine is a huge amount, then it becomes very difficult for people who don't have that view, and I think it's quite simple like that. But what I'd like to start with is, you must have had a journey yourself, and perhaps a very difficult journey for you to then realize the importance of giving a mic to this community, and amplifying these voices. So I wonder what was maybe going on for you, at the time, where maybe the first time you were sharing your story, or maybe the first time you were recognizing the need to amplify these voices.
Yeah, I just realized that. So I had some music playing, and I just realized that my speakers are in the background they're sounding off. So hopefully that's not a distraction to anybody here. So yes, indeed, it became important to share our stories. And I was reflecting on that process this morning. How did I get the courage to even start? And I think we want to maybe start in that space. So here at Bethel, so as you mentioned, I'm on staff here at Bethel Church, and I'm a pastor. I was introduced to a couple of other men, Ken Williams and Roger Gaskin, in 2015. And Ken was a pastor here. And I had never met anyone who had, like me, left LGBT. I had never had a conversation where we said, this is what happened. How did you do that? What role did your faith play? What were the different pressures? What did you discover about yourself? And so a friend introduced us, and we began meeting. We pulled one other friend, Roger, in, and for about a year, maybe even a little over a year, we got together every week over coffee in Ken's office. And we had no intention of publicly sharing. We weren't creating an organization or a ministry. We were excited to be able to talk about everything that had happened to us. Now, Ken and Roger had decades really of in their past, they had gone through programs like Living Waters, maybe you've heard of them, and sought out counseling and other things. And I had not really been exposed to any of the so-called ex-gay world. My exit from the LGBT world, as my testimony showed, the slides that you showed, I had an experience in my faith that caused me to question not my sexuality, because I had a well-developed theological viewpoint that embraced same-sex sexuality. But my experience caused me to question what I believed about God. And while I was a pastor, and so I stepped back and reevaluated what I believed. And it was in that process that I began exploring different expressions of Christian faith and different understandings of God than I had been raised with. And it was that journey partnered with, so the discovery of God in that journey, and then my ability to enter into new places of meditation and prayer and self-discovery, really, from that space that was very sacred to me, that unraveled all of the childhood perceptions that I had about my sexual identity. That's a very long story. But so my own journey was really isolated in comparison to Ken's. So I was curious, and so we got together and we talked about the Bible, and we talked about different counseling experiences they had had, and we talked about different churches, and every week we were hungry to just hear, how did this happen? How did we change? And after about a year of doing that, we realized that we knew quite a lot. That we, if we pooled all of our combined knowledge, that we would have information that other people would want to know. And at about that time, Ken was invited to speak at our ministry school. So Bethel Church had, well, it still has, a very large ministry school. And so we have roughly, usually around 2,000 students in the ministry school. And Ken was invited to speak to the first year student body class. And he said to the leadership, hey, I've been meeting with these other friends. Could we all share and talk about this experience? And it was really the first time, this was in 2016, it was the first time the church had ever said anything really overtly about LGBT. It wasn't a teaching topic. It was something that members of the church confronted or discussed, and ministries, we have an inner healing ministry here, a counseling ministry here at Bethel. Certainly they had engaged it in different ways, but in terms of teaching or speaking to the student body, that had never happened. And so we were all three invited to simply share our stories. And then we did a panel discussion with leaders, with leaders here at the church. And so I had been a teacher at that point. So I had moved from the Midwest out to Reading and was teaching in the ministry school, but nobody knew anything about my background at all. And so I ended up sharing. And of course, the first time I shared my testimony, in that first week, we shared with the first and second year students. So it's a 3-year program that we shared first and second year students. So I shared with about 1,800 students.
Wow.
So as a first time kind of testimony experience, it was full on. And my students were stunned. And all I can say is that the process of, I don't think I could have done it unless I had spent all of that time that year ahead talking about my story over and over and over again with these friends, so that I knew their stories, they knew mine, and we had processed those. So I was comfortable talking about those things. And then when I finally went public with it, it was still a pretty closed space. So it wasn't live streamed. It wasn't in the newspaper. Like, there was no way, unless, someone recorded it with their handset, there was no way it was going to go really broad, but still it was a big crowd. And my experience out of that was people were surprised. People were sometimes shocked. At that point, they weren't offended. So today, often I share my story, they are flat out offended. But at that point, it was such a new idea to most people that I was met with curiosity and really affirmation. And of course, in this environment here at Bethel, I pretty typically get affirmation for what I'm saying.
No speaker lost.
But so that experience was profound and encouraging. And when
Stereo mode. What? Right.
I hope you can't hear that
No,
in the
it's okay.
background.
No speaker lost.
Wish I could turn those off in the fly, but I can't. But anyway, I think it shifted what I believed about myself and how important it was to share. Because what I discovered was that my own authenticity, and actually at this point, I'm willing to share details about what I experienced and what I understand about my past. The level of authenticity that I was able to engage allowed other people to meet me in that space, whether they had a same-sex experience in their past or not. And so it broke open this realization that it's worthwhile to explore your identity and how did you get to be the way you are? And the LGBT narrative of you're born this way, which is pretty fully debunked by science. That myth is so pervasive. When you start to say, well, I had this pressure, and I experienced that yielded this perception. It wasn't necessarily that I was abused. It wasn't necessarily that I had terrible parents. It was the perfect storm of years of childhood development that led me to this space. It pretty profoundly changes how you think of yourself as a man or a woman. When you're able to tear away the LGBT narrative and say, oh, there are actually good reasons for why I am the way I am, discoverable reasons. And that is, I think, the real beauty of sharing your story. I think that in our world where we have so many people that are dissociating from their bodies, for example, with the transgender experience, it's so vital that we begin to realize that, oh, we're actually, my imagination and my mind can't actually be separated from my body. I am a fully integrated person, and it's all working together to create who I am. I can't be separated from my body, and my socialization has everything to do with who I am today.
Absolutely, and thank you for sharing that experience, and that it being a gradual step. And just as you've been saying, I've been reflecting on my story, or the story of a lot of people who come out, and it is at the first time, it's not understanding what is going on with ourselves, and then speaking to a healthy community, which makes us feel accepted and affirmed, and then having the courage to then share that, which is a big step. And in your case, the 1,800 audience is definitely a massive step, to come out and speak your truth. And I think once that you do that, in a lot of our experiences, a key thing that keeps us back is shame, and having the shame that we have the attraction. Whereas once we be vulnerable and we go out and say, hey, this is my reality, this is my truth, this is what I'm living with, we find that people are okay, and and it's okay to share that, and almost the anxiety or the shame or the worry that we were carrying for a very long time isn't there, which is very ironic to what kind of the opponents say, because people come us to say, oh, you don't want the LGBTQ community to speak, and we're like, no, we want everybody to speak their experiences and to come out and be their authentic, real selves, because that is what is healthy. It's healthy for people to come out. And in so many areas of life, we have diverse perspectives. We have diverse perspectives in everything. As you're saying, perhaps at that time, it was something which was unheard of or new, because there was only one narrative which was being shown, and having that opposing narrative. And I think that's really healthy in showing the diversity of human experiences, and kind of allowing and also, I would say, your story must have inspired so many other people to go to your website, to share their story and say, oh, Elizabeth's done it. So I'm sure I'd be able to do that as well. And the uniqueness of each story and the power that each story has is really something.
Mhm. I think that I hope anyway, that it helps people to understand that the experience is very complex. We maybe in the political arena oversimplify the experience. And when you start to look at how people have addressed it, people have walked away or reshaped their sense of self-identity, I think it's encouraging for many people, not just people with LGBT connections in their own lives.
Absolutely.
I think also there's an important place in our culture right now. Well, let me back up. One of the things that I raise awareness of when I'm speaking is that the Pride community, the power of the Pride community is the depth of the shame that they live with. And the reason why it's called Pride is because of the shame, the humiliation, the social stigma. And so out of that, with our culture, one of our shared values is humility. And so the conflict that you experience in, should I embrace this, should I not? When you're experiencing shame and you press against that to say, come out and identify as lesbian or gay, over and above your past or your cultural setting, your family's values, when you do that, you want to protect that status with all that you have. And so the pushback by the Pride community against our values, perhaps, is born out of deep pain, born out of self-protection. And I think the violence of that act, so the violence of their protective stance, like the anti-discrimination stance and all of the conversion therapy legislation that we see around the world, in my opinion, is born mostly out of pain. Having not been able to find resolution, having not been able to perhaps completely belong in the setting in which they were raised, all of the stigma around the experience and the rejection, there's a great deal of self-rejection that then gets imprinted on every one of your relationships. And so the whole thing, I want to say my truth or your truth, but on the other hand, there's this larger reality that people, even within the LGBT community, are not being allowed to really live the truth that they are men and women, and the truth of their sexuality, just observable by their bodies.
Yeah, absolutely. I think when you limit, it's almost, it's funny because when we talk about conversion therapy saying you only have one worldview or you have only one type of thinking. It's actually what we find the other way, that, you know, if you have very stringent thinking that no, you're born this way, or you can't change, or, you know, and it, you know, and then of course, you know, like we have this saying that falsehood needs legs, truth doesn't need legs, right? So when they say that, okay, there is, you can't change, but then they celebrate bisexuality, or they say people have sexual fluidity, or they'll embrace someone who maybe was in a marriage and now isn't in a marriage or identifies as gay. But if it's the other way around, they won't mention it. So there's, you know, there is, as you say, there's truths there which aren't there. And I really liked your way of putting it. The depth of their pride kind of shows their extent of the shame. And you know, when I look into, I do connect with the self-rejection, the pain, and that was something that was in my story. And I was thinking, oh, you know, like if only people accepted me for who I was, you know. And that's why they're going in and they're doing the pride, and they're still thinking, oh, they're still not accepting us, they want us to change, and they're having these bans. Whereas if as a community they had the inner peace that you get from knowing the truth, and you know, like you said, connecting with your body, being at one with yourself, finding yourself and finding that peace within yourself, maybe they would not be so pushing all the time, or making sure that people accept who they are, because they've, you know, it takes a level of maturity, emotional maturity, to disagree, right? So it takes a level of being comfortable with who we are, and appreciating diversity and appreciating difference. So this is the irony. They talk about diversity and they talk about differences and embracing the rainbow because the rainbow's got many colors. But what if, you know, what if we are included in that rainbow, and that we're saying, okay, we don't identify as LGBTQ, but we're same-sex attracted, or we, you know, we have gender conflict, gender dysphoria. Why can't we be included in this rainbow of diversity and difference? And why does it have to be one narrative which is there? So absolutely. I also wanted to ask, it was 2015, as you mentioned, with I guess the startings of the change movement. Looking back, what are some of the things that have made you really, really proud, and, you know, kind of really, really grateful in the journey that you've been in so far?
Well, yeah. So when we started, as I was mentioning, we created a ministry that we called Equipped to Love. And our focus there was somewhat like strong support, in the sense of we wanted to create an environment for peer support. We wanted to be able to speak with parents and Christian leaders and say, hey, actually, let's demystify the LGBTQ experience a little bit so that you can relate. And then let's change the dynamics so that people feel embraced and welcomed, and can walk this out, can continue to walk out their faith away from that world. And pretty much we started that in 2017, right after we kind of started speaking publicly. We went ahead and established that ministry. And then 1 year later, the state of California introduced a bill. It was a consumer fraud bill. So already in California, conversion therapy was illegal for minors. And by that, what was meant predominantly was a licensed counselor could not offer change allowing therapy, right? For minors, that would be children in California under the age of 15. But so legislators introduced a bill. It was a consumer fraud bill. And it said essentially, it said any suggestion that sexual orientation can change should be considered fraud. We know that sexual orientation doesn't change. So any service or any resource that would be offered for sale should be banned in the state of California and be considered fraud. And of course, that directly impacted us. Ken just published his first, he published a curriculum and he published a memoir. Let's see. Got a copy of it right here. So his book, The Journey Out, talks about, it talks a little bit about his personal experience in walking out, but then it's all about some really important keys like finding community, finding healthy community, or discovering, really exploring your identity with a different lens, or surrendering your beliefs, some of your beliefs, in order to move out away from that world. So it would have been illegal to sell in the state of California. So we thought, well, that's not going to work for us. So we started going down to Sacramento, which is where the state capital is here in California, and listening to the debates. And we got connected to the opposition team, which was a diverse group of conservatives that were opposing this bill because it's a limitation on free speech and freedom of religion. And we ended up getting roped in and testifying in the state capitol. So, I mean, thankfully, I did have the context of sharing to 1,000 or more people, but then it hit the next level really fast. And Ken and I both ended up testifying in almost all of the state hearings, the public hearings. And that was very frightening. I can just say, like, that was next level. You know, it's one thing to say to your church community that this is your life experience, but it was an entirely different thing to look at the LGBT community and the legislators who were gay in the Capitol and say, and this is my life experience. So it was trial by fire for us. And at one point, it was really obvious that legislators didn't believe us. They couldn't, you know, people don't change. They looked at us like, yeah, you're. So we thought, what can we do? We were driving home, what can we do? And Ken thought we should publish a book. And of course, this would be the kind of resource that would be made illegal. And so what we did was we called about 30 of our friends that we knew, which was about all the friends that we knew. Like we didn't have it at that point, a year in. We weren't actually trying to collect stories at that point. We were just trying to walk with people that were in our church. And so we called a bunch of our friends and we captured their stories. And that was the first book. And that book is comprised of, it doesn't have any rhetoric. It's just a photo layout with about a 500-word story, very brief. And most of the stories kind of talk about the resources that people needed in order to move on. And we then invited all of them to come to Sacramento, and we signed our pages, and then we went into the state capitol and we handed a book to every state senator. We went in, we shared our stories personally, individually, talked to staffers and senators. And then the next day, which was the day of the Senate Judiciary hearing, we did a rally on the Capitol steps. So those of us that were able to be in Sacramento, we shared our testimonies from the Capitol steps and live streamed that. And so it turned out to be roughly 2.5 hours of live testimony of people who had left LGBT. And that live stream went viral. So, I mean, I don't know. I think it has
I remember seeing that. Yeah. I was
1.3
like, wow,
million views.
amazing.
And that was the birthing moment really for change. So we didn't have a plan to create a ministry or an organization called Changed. We were just calling it Changed because that was the point. We're going to poke the bear basically by calling it Changed. We wanted to be as provocative as we could be. And that then set things in motion. In fact, I have, if you let me share my screen, I think I have a couple of photos of that time.
That'd be brilliant.
Let's see, I'm just going to advance through. That was me 20 years ago.
Wow, I can't believe that. Wow, it's amazing.
Yeah. So here's Changed, and you did a great job just showing some pictures of our website. But so here was the day, this was June 18th that we staged this rally, and we got these Changed t-shirts, and the look of the t-shirts and then the book kind of became iconic for our movement. We got together the day before, we all signed our books and broke up into teams. And then the next day kind of went to the Capitol. We did this kind of little gathering on the Capitol steps. And in the hearing even, so that's one of the senators from the Judiciary Committee hearing. He had a copy, he had his copy, and he said, I acknowledge that your group is here. But, you know, they still dismissed us. And there we were, they said, well, you don't understand the bill, because someone had suggested that the language of this bill could actually ban the Bible. And the legislators thought that was ridiculous. And so probably 400 Christians attended the committee hearing. And in a committee proceeding, you do the hearing where you have an opposition side and a proponent side, and they share a little bit of testimony, and then there's Q&A from the senators on the committee. And then members of the public at large can come up to a mic and just simply say, I'm opposed or I'm for the bill. They can't say anything else. And 400 Christians showed up and opposed the bill, and yet the hearing still proceeded. They passed the bill. And so it was an entrance into the reality of how much discrimination there is on a political level. But we ended up publishing this book. We're in the 3rd or 4th edition of it, I think. So this was us on the Capitol steps.
Amazing.
Very fun. One of the things that happened out of that live stream then, which was interesting. So we had a large Chinese church in attendance, because one of the pastors in this Chinese church from the Bay Area had a changed story. And so he came and shared his story, and many of his members of his congregation came, which, I mean, Ali, that's a very big deal. I mean, I think the cultural,
crazy. Yeah,
right,
yeah.
the cultural dynamic there for the Chinese church to show up probably is similar from a Muslim context. And so then in Taiwan, they were at the time considering a marriage referendum, whether to pass a gay marriage referendum. And so a listener there in the audience said, we need to do this in Taiwan. So they ended up doing an open air testimony event, just like we did, only, you know, theirs was in Chinese. And they took the changed book and they published it in Chinese, and did the same thing in Taiwan. That was amazing. And so kind of very soon after that, we went to the United States Capitol in Washington, D.C., and did a similar event where we did a press conference, and then we went in and started speaking to legislators who would hear from us. And that has kind of catalyzed what Changed is doing, really. What we discovered was I don't know if I believe that what our testimonies in different legislative settings would influence American legislation. I mean, I hope so. I hope that it encourages freedom of speech and freedom of religion. But I think that more than anything, it invites people to better understand the complexity of the experience and for people to hear more than one narrative. Because it seems like the LGBT born that way narrative it's such a clear path. People seem to understand it very clearly. But when you start to talk about, say, Muslim identity or Christian identity, that's very obscure and easily distorted, easily villainized even. And so people don't really get to hear. And so we're able to take our stories into that big platform where there is lots of controversy. And because of the controversy, it causes question. It causes our stories to go much broader than they ever would if we just stayed in a church setting. And the controversy, though painful, very painful at times, enables people to start to question what is this? Not just what has changed, but what is our sexual identity? And how is that being shaped? And what does psychology have to do with it? What does counseling have to do with it? What truly is harm? What role can faith play in a person's life? And really, we had no idea what we were getting into in the beginning, but it just keeps going. It keeps growing. And what I've learned is that the more I share, it doesn't make conflict any easier. I'm actually a very shy person. I'm a quiet and a shy person. And I don't like conflict. Which could be why I'm doing, I don't know, it could be why I'm in this arena, because it means that I try to be very empathetic. I try to enter into this space with a great deal of compassion and neutrality, and offer kindness in the midst of the conversation when there's so much vitriol. And being able to do that against the offense. So, when someone is saying bad things about me, it's very hard to be neutral and to be kind. And it goes both ways. Like I know, for example, that in the United States lately, there's been a great deal of conversation about transgenderism or the transgender experience. And there are a handful of conservative states that have raised legislation that bans surgical procedures, medicalization of children. And these bills are starting to pass. And so they're touted as anti-transgender bills. And they are harming transgender children, according to the media. But what these bills are seeking to do is impose a wait period so that a person who is questioning their gender or who has gender conflict can wait until their bodies are developed, their brains are developed, to make a decision, to make an informed decision on whether to go through surgery to alter their bodies. On the flip side, people who have transgender identifying children, there are many on the opposite side of the aisle who would believe exactly what you are saying. Okay, if I have a transgender identifying child, will that child be taken from me? you know, from a conservative angle, the fear is that the pro-LGBTQ lobby would call it child abuse to try to encourage an alignment with their biological sex. On the progressive side, there is great fear that this legislation will cause a person who has a transgender identifying child to lose their child and be forced to align with their biological sex against the ideology, the trans ideology. So there's an almost equal mirror of fear on both sides. And so in the engagement of the topic, it's so important, in my opinion, to be able to know that and to think through, okay, how can we find a middle ground? Like, how should we find a middle ground? I mean, I don't, you know, in the medicalization of children, I tend to think of that as child abuse. But okay, is there an alternative? Those things have to be discussed in the public arena. And if we can't come together to have those discussions, then we will, I think we will disintegrate as a culture.
Exactly. It's about having challenging conversations with and being respectful, you know, and I think that's all we're asking for, is having different opinions, and for those different opinions to be valued equally, and, you know, not preferring one over the other, which is ironically what they claim to do. You know, in their legislation, they will claim to say that, but when they will share, so we have this in the UK, we have the memorandum of conversion therapy, which is signed by all the healthcare bodies, and it will say one gender identity or one sexual orientation isn't preferable to another, which is great, which is a really neutral way of looking at it. But then when we see the preferred providers or preferred way, or if you want to find more help about this, they're all LGBTQ charities, and there isn't then saying, well, if you're a person of faith, or you don't even need to be a person of faith, you can just be someone who, like you say, if you're transgender, wants to explore their compatibility with their biological sex, and like you say, watchful waiting, which is ironically was it's a medical term for gender dysphoria, is what's been medically there, and it's almost like the medicine is now being affected by political view, even though that the government claims, oh, we're not going to go in clinicians' independence. That is effectively what happens, because it's not so much the law, it's the effects, unintended consequences that law then puts in. Because then if like you said, like change being someone, you know, a movement which is talking about sexual orientation, if you just limit sexual orientation in the lens of LGBTQ, and, you know, then you are you're oppressing the other minority, even though, you know, I always think, as you are, I think people have a goodwill in their hearts when they do these legislations. They want to protect the minority, and they want to make sure that, you know, they're not, the minority isn't being abused, and that makes complete sense. But when you introduce a law, you know, a law is a very sharp knife to something. You know, it's not like regulation, it's professional guidance. The crazy part, at least in the UK, is there's no legislation covering therapy, so anybody can call themselves a counselor. You know, it's not like in the US where it's a protected title. So we don't have a legislation covering therapy. So the first legislation in the history of the United Kingdom, which is coming in, is about sexuality and gender, whereas we don't even have legislation covering the whole of therapy or saying therapy should be a protected title. So it speaks volumes about the concentration of some minorities over other minorities. And we were having this discussion. We have Equality Act that, you know, that you must not be discriminated with your age, your religion, you know, you have all of these protected characteristics, yet the sexuality and gender somehow feels that it has its own priority above race, above age, above, you know, faith, sex, exactly. So, and I think that's what we're experiencing now, that with the transgender movement, it's now threatening women's spaces, or the, you know, that now it's the sex characteristic which is being left. And yeah, and to be honest, very, very difficult to be equal and fair for all. And we realize it's very difficult, but I think more and more, at least in the UK, we are finding that when people are forcibly or fed one type of narrative, and a discussion is stifled, as you're saying, your incredible experience of 400 Christians coming in to testify, them, you giving the book, and still they, you know, they're not listening, and still they're saying to go a certain way, that the narrative will wear thin, and that people will realize, oh, actually, you know, we're not favoring the minority here. What we're doing is we're creating more problems, where now other people are being negatively impacted by the law, by taking, you know, and within, even if you speak within the LGBTQ community, there's not a monolith in understanding these things. There is a diversity within the LGBTQ community, which will say, actually, I know people in the LGBT community will say, well, if they're people of faith and they want to go a certain way, they should be allowed to do that, right? So, and I think it's a very, like you said, it's an oversimplification of this issue, and I think what you know, it looks like, you know, God's hand in playing in what you did, how you described to us how you started. Your intentions weren't to have this huge organization with the movement change, which just came about because, rightly so, you wanted to get your message out there, so you picked something which was provocative, and to see that those stories, those brave stories of your friends would testify at state level, you know, and really the power, you know, you can clearly see, and what you said, I love what you said about being at the front lines, because when you're in your faith community, or when you're in your church, it's okay to talk about these issues. But when you're at the front line and saying, look, this is, you know, that is another level, that's being really, really confident in your story. And it's really, you know, it's amazing to see how other parts in the world, like you said, China has the Chinese church completely loved what the change movement was doing, and use that to help with their legislation with marriage.
One of the interesting things, so the legislation as it was presented in California, in the end, didn't pass. So it passed out of that committee, but in the end, the sponsor of the bill withdrew it on the last day when it could have been voted into place. And one of the reasons for that, I believe, is when he saw so many Christians opposing the bill, but speaking up, coming forward actively, he chose during the summer break to visit with pastors. So he did kind of a state tour and visited with some large church leaders. So large churches, the leaders of large churches, and invited pastors to speak with him, which was incredibly notable. He was a gay man who he was Taiwanese by ethnicity and had Christianity in his past, but didn't have a good experience with that. Yet he was willing to be brave enough to cultivate conversation. And really, I think it was his good faith effort and the leaders that he spoke with who were integrous that in the end allowed that bill to just kind of be withdrawn and so that we can still continue doing what we're doing. Was the power of dialogue and diplomacy and being willing to acknowledge, oh, okay, there's more going on here than meets the eye, at least at that time, really made a difference. It was profound to see, and I really wish it could happen on a larger level. Because honestly, what I read is the extremes of both sides, as I suggested earlier, actually have very similar views, very similar fears. And so like being able to bring that together and say, well, what is the fear? The big fear here is I'm going to lose my children to the state. And so there are just so many good conversations that can come out of the courage that it takes to share your story.
Yes, absolutely. Yeah. And as you said, that if we live in a world where it becomes illegal to share your life story, then we know the extent of where we are and where we've reached. So I think that really puts it sharply into into picture, as you say, definitely. Well, we have a section for Q&A as well, a part of this webinar. Before we move on to that, is there anything you would like to add or like to share before we go on to Q&A? Something that
no, I do want to suggest though that while it's important to be able to share your story, it's also important to be able to honor those who are a part of your story. And whether that's your family or particularly if they're perpetrators of abuse in your past, when you share publicly, to be aware that your story actually impacts quite a few people. And, so I'm very hesitant. I encourage people to be very reflective of the impacts of their story before they start to share. How is it going to impact their parents' reputation, or their family, or people who might have harmed them, either intentionally or not, when they were children? Like, it's so we don't realize, but we actually impact a lot of people and have been impacted by a lot of people. And so as we start to share these stories, we certainly don't want to be raising accusations or causing harm to those people that we love. So it's, the story sharing, actually, it's an opportunity to really grow closer maybe to some of those important connections and build trust with them before you actually start to speak about your life experiences on this topic in particular.
Yes, yeah, and it's so important to have that understanding that it's a community which allows you to share a story. It's not just you, it's your friends, it's your family. It's having that support system around yourself, and knowing if your family would be adversely affected by it as well is so important, because yeah, and kind of acknowledging the that, like you said, the support system which is in place, and honoring that, because I think that's what people don't see. They just see the story and they don't see the people around that individual who have made it safe and has enabled for that story to be out. And you know, like I say, it's a testament to all the courageous people who have shared that. And obviously we pray that they are protected from any type of adverse or unintended consequences by just speaking out and sharing their truth, because it's ironic that it's easier to come out as gay, but it's harder to come out as same-sex attracted. So absolutely, yeah. Brilliant. So we have the Q&A section as usual, and I can see a number of you have been putting in, at least those of you in Zoom have been putting in questions. So what you can do is you can upvote as well. You can be anonymous. If you would like, you can also raise your hand and then you can ask a question. Just be aware that your name will show if you choose that option. So yes. So I'm just going to start look at some of the questions. So yes. Oh, I've just seen this is recorded. Sorry, I've not been seeing my I haven't seen my questions. Sorry. Okay, so let's see. So the first, there's one question. So I'm going to pick that one. With all of the, oh, this is about Facebook. Okay. With all of the current conversion therapy bans throughout the world, do you think there will be no SSA websites or Facebook support groups in the future? So talking about Facebook now. Yeah.
I mean, I think that it could be possible that groups like this or conversations even like this could be suppressed, but I don't think it will be possible for the experience as a whole to be suppressed. I think honestly that there will never be a time when there will not be people leaving LGBTQ. Like I think that there will always be people dissatisfied with that life and seeking a different way forward. And as long as that is the case, I think there will always be communities like this in one way or the other. We will find ourselves.
Thank you. Next question. How do you respond to individuals who assert that despite the fact that sexual orientation is not genetic, it cannot be changed, and that for the great majority of people, sexual attractions may diminish, but orientation never changes? So I guess what there's asking that is, I think maybe we've covered some of this, isn't it?
I think, you know, the larger question about, well, does sexual orientation actually change? I think that when we think about that question, we have to think about what sexual orientation actually is. Is there such a thing as sexual orientation? Should be a semantic question we're asking. Because I think it's completely possible for any human to do any sexual act they desire or they long to do. So then if I desire to do what we would call marginalized sexual acts, does that mean that's my orientation? We need to ask that question in a public discussion, really, because orientation is not scientific, in my opinion. But then does sexual orientation change? Can it change? Is it harmful for a person to try to change? I think those are highly subjective questions. Whether sexual orientation can change depends entirely on the motivations of the person itself, or him or herself. Like my desire to change my sexual orientation is born out of a variety of reasons: my faith, my desire to be true to my body, other ideas. So my dedication to change is a large player in whether my sexual orientation will change. But then on top of that, I believe that we're discovering that childhood development has everything to do with the formation of our sexual identity. And so is it worthwhile to understand, oh, these childhood perceptions or these challenges that I experienced and weathered as a child that created this mindset and self-perception also influenced how my body responded to situations. We're learning through neuroplasticity and other things how our thinking actually changes our body and vice versa. We're actually an integrated being. And so I think that the notion of what we're sexually attracted to is it can be very fluid. Can we intentionally direct it? Well, some of us certainly have. I have experienced change. Ken Williams has experienced change. And, one of the big points of pain there is if your same-sex attractions diminish to the point where your opposite sex attractions increase, but you still experience a measure of same-sex attraction, does that mean that you should prioritize same-sex attraction above opposite sex attraction? And that is really the root, in my opinion, of the controversy. Because honestly, the majority statistically of people who experience same-sex attraction also experience opposite sex attraction. So then the question is, if you can, through counseling or through your faith or your personal journey, understand better or shape better your desires, should you still protect your same-sex desires because they exist, simply because they exist? The LGBTQ community would say, yes, you should prioritize that. Faith backgrounds like mine say, no, heterosexuality and opposite sex desires are truer to your biological truth and truer to your faith. And so I'm going to prioritize those.
Absolutely, yeah. And, just to put so well, the semantics of how this debate is so problematic for us as you said, people of faith. So for example, we hold the view that there is no such thing as sexual orientation. So even the words homosexual, heterosexual, we only find in the 1900s. So even before that, there wasn't a concept of having a sexual identity with a sexual act, and it was just a case of attractions or desires. And as you can said, a human can have any attraction or any desire, and to take to then, so now when we're dealing with semantics like LGBTQ, which is an identity, and then orientation, which is again a false word, and then when they say, well, you're trying to change that, when you're like, no, I think, and it goes back to the human experience of saying we all have different attractions, and we may choose to prioritize some attractions over another, and everybody should have the freedom to do that, and to be very clinical and say, oh, have you completely changed? Because I think that's one of the things that people say is, and have you and then what does that even look like? So if we explore that and then say, okay, any other issue, okay, say I'm trying to give up, I don't know, chocolate, right? So I've given up chocolate. Do you still have cravings of chocolate? Well, yes, I still have cravings, but am I eating chocolate? No. So does that mean that I'm still I've still not fully recovered because I still have the craving? Just because we've decided not to do something, or we decided not to act on it, and we have the attractions to it, doesn't mean we're unsuccessful, or doesn't mean we've not changed, or doesn't mean, so I think because years and years of indoctrination on sexuality has been so problematic, where we have taken sexuality as an identity. And one of the things people say is, are you straight? And I'm saying, no, I'm not straight, because I don't believe in that term. I don't believe what that means. I don't know what that actually is. And then they're like, I don't know where I can place you, because they want to put us in a box, and they want to say, okay, this is what you are. You're bi. Oh no, you're straight. Oh no, they're like, say, oh, you can't change. You must be bi. You can't change. And it's so difficult for them to just see it in a very simple way, which is that we have different attractions, we have different things, like, so when this legislation comes to us and they say sexual orientation change efforts, well, it's a bit like, well, we don't believe in the concept of orientation, so this doesn't apply to us. And you're so right. It's having the semantics of this debate is problematic. So when they talk to us in that language, it's very difficult for them to understand. I love this quote. We've got a quote which is saying, it's not about straight, it's about redeemed, and so much of us have had that connection with God, in which we've repented, we've gone back to God, and we've discovered a new meaning, a new purpose in our lives, an identity perhaps which is stronger than a physiological attraction or an identity or something like that. And I think that's because they don't understand that, or maybe they're not kind of understanding the point where we're coming from. It becomes a very binary kind of debate, and life unfortunately isn't binary.
So black and white.
Experience. Yes, yeah. No, thank you. So I'm just be conscious of time as well. So the next question is, how do you respond to those who say most ex-gays are miserable and most eventually return to the gay identity?
Well, I think that that's an extremely subjective and narrow-minded perspective. So I guess I would ask, how many ex-gay people do you know and have you spoken with personally? I could equally say something as banal as every LGBTQ identifying person has been sexually abused and is suppressing pain. That's just as offensive. And so I think that I could point someone to a study that was done by Dr. Christopher Rosick and others, pointing to a study that they did about, I think it was published 2 years ago, studying people of faith, LGBTQ identifying people of faith, and measuring whether they were more satisfied or less satisfied because of their decision to follow their faith, which was to not act on same-sex sexual feelings. And the outcome of that study was that they were measurably happier, that they were more content, they had better, healthier community. They were doing less risky behaviors, so their bodies were not at risk. And so statistically, I could say, according to the studies that I'm aware of, that's not true. And perhaps that's an adequate response.
Absolutely. No, thank you. Thank you for that. I think the next comment is just what we've said. Do you believe the majority of today's anxiety is not primarily about attractions, but the identity and the push to label themselves? So we've already discussed that one. That's right. Next question, how are Christians dealing with LGBTQ affirmative churches? It seems to be persuasive. Well, I can say the same thing for our communities, but I'd like to see what your experience is within the church.
Well, as you mentioned at the beginning, my background was in the gay affirming church, and I moved out of that position. I've been married to my husband for 17 years. So the gay affirming church movement, what I can say, in my opinion, is splitting the church and really is leading to the establishment of a new expression of Christianity that is doctrinally a new religion. I wouldn't even call it a new denomination. I would say it's an entirely new religion that is forming out of this progressive Christian thought. Maybe I've heard some compare it to Buddhism versus Hinduism. Like I feel like we're watching the emergence of a completely different pseudo-Christian religion. And I say pseudo-Christian because how can you consider yourself traditionally Christian if you're unwilling to align with the stated doctrines in the Bible? And so that's going to have to be my stake in the ground, what we believe about Jesus Christ and what we believe doctrinally from Scripture has to be Christian faith. And so what I'm watching happening in gay affirming church movements is an entirely new definition of who God is, what the significance of the atonement is, what it means to follow Christ as a disciple. There's an entirely new meaning emerging that actually suppresses the Bible. Now, there's a middle ground that's emerging that seeks to embrace LGBTQ identifying people, acknowledge their label, their self-proclaimed label, but encourage them to align with the doctrines of Scripture. I consider that dangerous because I feel that LGBTQ identity competes with Christian identity, and I believe it prioritizes LGBTQ above Christian identity, and I feel that that's dangerous for the faith. I can't take that position myself, but quite a few Christians are doing that and believing that just simply following the tenets of sexual behavior as outlined in the Bible are enough. I'm going to leave that up to the individual willing to take that risky step in their faith. I think that's a risky step. But as I said, what is happening though, certainly is a new religion is forming, in my opinion.
Absolutely. I mean, we have the same challenge in the Muslim community with the LGBTQ affirming Muslims, and then them reinterpreting the story of Lot and then saying, oh, it's about rape and it's not about homosexuality, or they'll come up with something, and like you said, it's not, you can't take one part and just say, oh, this is this, because what the movement does is it undermines the family, the nuclear family with a mother and a father, and anything that undermines that is critical to kind of Abrahamic faiths in understanding of the importance of a mother, the importance of a father, and having that. And the LGBTQ ideology kind of challenges that in its core, in its essence, in terms of family values. And you're absolutely right that a lot of faith communities have this dilemma in saying, okay, this is a minority, we need to still help them, but when they are under a false identity, it's almost like I think of it as, if I have a friend who is struggling, would I just unconditionally accept him, or would I have the courage to say, perhaps maybe you want to explore that this identity may not be completely right for you, right? Rather than just completely accepting, I would want my friends to check up on me and say, hey, Ali, that's wrong, right? And then they're true friends, because then they're, they really care for me, and we go beyond that discomfort of them challenging me. And that's highlighting a healthy society where I can still disagree. I can still disagree with what they're saying or what they're doing, but I can see their love in saying, I'm worried for you. So I think maybe this identity isn't the right thing. If we start the conversation by saying, oh, it's okay how you are, then we are compromising what our values are and what our beliefs are. I think there's a fine line between empathy and acceptance, and getting that right. So no, thank you. That was very well said.
I don't believe, some believe this, but I don't believe that LGBTQ is simply a state of being, like a descriptor of what same-sex attraction is. I believe that the label is connected to the entire structure, the entire worldview that includes the gay community and all of the marginalized and unacceptable, even perverse sexual behaviors that are a part of that world. And so I think that once again, we come down to semantics.
Absolutely. So the next question is, if a person's SSA has not changed after years of counseling, how should they address the issue? I don't want to remain depressed and miserable forever. The pain is unbearable sometimes. So this is basically saying, if counseling as an intervention hasn't helped, how should we proceed?
Well, that's so tough. I'm really sorry to hear that it's that hard. I know that, or I believe that the experience is, it's directly connected to our relational ability. And so I would just encourage you, one, to not give up, but to find the community, the people that you need around you to support you as you hit those hard spots. Find the community that will continue to encourage you and meet some of the needs. I know that can be a really lonely place to meet those places. In my own journey, what I discovered was that my same-sex feelings, the same-sex attraction, I developed a pattern of prayer when I experienced same-sex attraction, where I began inviting God to tell me more about those feelings, tell me why I was having those feelings, what I was longing for. And what I discovered was those feelings often were legitimate needs that I was seeking to meet in an unhealthy way. And so maybe you would be able to enter into this space of questioning what you need in that moment that wouldn't exactly be assuaged by simply acting on the same-sex attraction. Could be a moment of insecurity where you need affirmation, or it could be a moment of comparison where you feel maybe less than your peers, or less than someone that you're observing. Understanding those pressures that we have for ourselves and then finding the positive way to address the need could be an approach that you could take when the counseling doesn't seem to be offering you the help that you need. And then I would say, find a different counseling option. Try something different or someone different, or take a break and partner with new friends or a new community, because belonging is super important in this journey. It's super important. And so I just would encourage you not to give up.
Thank you. And what you said, belonging, is so important. Like communities like your Elizabeth, which foster that sense of belonging and identity in a world where kind of you can't have that type of, as we said, it's easier to come out LGBTQ, and you have a whole host of organizations which are going to give you support. But if you're a member of faith, you're Christian, you're in a church, and you come out as same-sex attracted, maybe sometimes you're met with ideology which is saying, are you sure? Or like questioning whether you're, rather than giving support for that individual, rather than connecting them with people who are going through the same thing, and have that. And rightly, I think counseling is only one intervention, that there's so many other, your community, your family, your friends, faith connections, your relational connections, how you see things. It's and as you've been saying, that it's about being integrated. So we can't see sexuality as just one strand. We're a lot bigger than that. So we have to see the whole individual, and kind of see what's going on. And to be honest, like even in my work, it was like you start off by saying I have a sexuality problem, and then it's like, oh, I just have a human problem, right? We tend to specify things. We tend to say, oh, even to be honest, was discussing this, even same-sex attracted being a label, it's like, oh, well, does that serve me? Is that really who I am? Or do I have a deeper sense of self than that? Because sometimes we can become this is exactly what I am, and sometimes, and this was something I only discovered quite later on in my saying, okay, work, do I need to drop that label now? Do I need to kind of say, okay, and you're right. I just find that we're constantly evolving. We're constantly discovering who we are.
Yeah, I don't actually think that I think we're constantly being changed by virtue of what our life experiences are. I don't think that there's like one true self that I come back to. I think that year by year, as I mature, as I get older, I'm being changed by the culture I'm in, as well as my interior life. And so I do want to say that I think that one of the biggest pressures, or one of the most important things to confront, is just the need for relationship, intimate relationship. And what I mean by that is being seen and being known. And there can be so much self-rejection and so much detachment, where it can feel like you're rejected by everyone, or you can't relate to anybody and nobody knows you. And so it's so vital to be able to connect to a community. Maybe it's even just your family, where you feel completely known, completely seen, and cherished. Like Ken will say, you can't be loved unconditionally until people know your condition. And I think that's vital for anyone who has this life experience.
Yeah, that's so beautiful. Thank you. So I know we've got questions, but I'm conscious of time. Is there anything that you would like to share with us, Elizabeth?
Peruse a couple of these really quick.
Yeah, or we can go through some of the more of some of the questions.
I think, one point in pain for me is the comparison between changed movement and Exodus. And of course, there are going to be those accusations that we are like Exodus. I would want to say that the biggest difference between us and Exodus International is that we are really just a grassroots network of people. So Exodus was comprised of all the ministries and all the ministry leaders predominantly. And yet we're pretty much, we don't have a nonprofit status. We are pretty much just the people themselves who are walking out this experience in different ways. There are many, many different denominations and faith expressions that are connected to us. And so we don't seek to, I think Exodus had I don't know much about Exodus. I guess I can say that I was never a part of it. I have no idea, but we don't seek to say, hey, here's the right way forward, and this is what we endorse. We try to do our very best to acknowledge all the different people and approaches that are in our midst, that are presenting seemingly healthy options for people, safe and healthy options for people who want encouragement, want support, and want to be able to be affirmed in their decision not to embrace LGBTQ in their lives. And so, we haven't so far chosen to do like an international conference where everyone comes together and we talk about different inner healing modalities. We've just kind of been very cautious about that, really just wanting to acknowledge the different members that are part of our midst and embrace the journey of leaving LGBTQ without a lot of control. So hopefully that's your...
Absolutely. And I think people sometimes make comparisons, and like, especially the LGBTQ community, they'll say, oh, look, this or this leader comes in, or they failed, or this organization failed. And it's about seeing, well, okay, so that organization, or maybe, that failed, but can you deny people's choices, or can you deny people's stories, or can you deny people's experiences, or can you open your mind up to that there may be diverse experiences of human sexuality, and so on. And kind of like sometimes as as yourself, you never thought it'd be an organization, or you're saying it's not for profit. So, and we never see it as an organization. We always see it as they're a group of vulnerable people who need support, and they need that sense of belonging, like you said, that to be seen, that sense of identity, in the sense that I am worthy, and I am seen, and there are other brothers or sisters who are going through a similar thing than I am. And that's the most basic thing that you have in any community which you're building. And sometimes when we see things through a very organizational lens, we see people, or we see organization, we see organizations and we don't see people. And I think at least for change, if anything, it's you are probably the most organization which is speaking about your community, because you're highlighting the voices. So yeah, so I think a lot of the times we have unfortunately unfair comparisons and unfair kind of rhetoric which they kind of use. Because one of the things I really find annoying is that they will not allow voices which have been successful. So if you are going to talk about voices which went a different way, why not talk about voices which have been successful? And that's even in our own local media. Like we were approached by BBC or people, and then we say, yes, we will speak, and they'll say, okay, great, what's your perspective? And when they hear my perspective, they're like, actually, we don't want you to speak, because that challenges their perception that, oh, these organizations, they hate LGBTQ, they don't, they want everybody to be straight, or kind of like they're bigots or whatever. And when they actually come to us and hear us, and they're like, oh, actually, this isn't the narrative that we want to promote. Similarly, like what you saw in the courtroom, where they're like, we know you exist, but we're not going to listen to you, and I think that's the tragedy in some of these situations where they're painting one narrative. But things like you're doing, giving the microphone to the community itself and letting them have a platform where they feel they can go out and they can speak, and they can feel that sense of belonging, to be seen, is so important in a world which kind of wants to take their voice away.
Mm-hmm. That's really, I mean, I think that's very well said. I think that it could be more important to be able to create this space where alternative worldviews are valued. And I think that ultimately the conversation, every time I hear, is that harmful? Are you suppressing something? These questions, still yet I know hundreds, I might even be able to say I know of thousands of people who have chosen not to embrace LGBTQ in their life and are much happier because they did that.
Mhm.
And so then the question becomes, should that be suppressed? Should that be disallowed? Is it harmful? I just think that that is a very subjective question.
Exactly, like the studies that you mentioned by Christopher Rosick or Pila and Sutton, which are peer-reviewed, and they're showing improvement in emotional well-being. You know, what's the goal of therapy? What's the goal of these efforts? Is that you reach a sense of well-being. And when we are hearing these voices and they're saying, actually, I have benefited from this, I've gone through it, is that if I always think that if the therapy, especially in a therapeutic space, was so damaging, you are still in a professional environment where you can lodge a complaint, you can leave the therapy, you can, you can, even if we're talking about therapy in that sense, or even if it's in a church setting or a mosque setting, you have existing measures to do that. If you don't like that church, you can abandon that church or you abandon that mosque and then have that. It's the cancel culture, isn't it? Which basically says, I disagree with you, so I'm completely going to obliterate and ban, like you said, an alternative worldview, which then is antithetical to a liberal, they say they're liberal, right? They say that, we're freedom of choice and freedom, and it becomes like, well, if it's freedom and you really want to promote diversity, then we have to realize that people aren't monoliths, and there's an intersectionality between faith, sexuality, sex. There's intersectionality between all of these things, and I think slowly people, I'm just positive. I think slowly people are realizing, if they've been fed a certain type of narrative, because that's what people normally do, isn't it? Whatever narrative which is popular, they'll rebel against after 10-15 years of that narrative. And that's why when we talk about truth, we talk about truths within our personal experiences, which don't change. So for example, my perception of my sex, biological sex, that's true for me. It's not changing. I might change, my understanding might change, but there's certain truths which are going to stay with me, and I'm going to evolve with that. And I think slowly people are opening up to real diversity, real differences, and kind of slowly seeing that. It was interesting because I spoke to my mom about this, right? And it was really interesting what she said. She said, you have to realize the LGBT community have had a long time where you could only be straight and you couldn't be anything, right? So she views it as saying, now that finally they're having their say, they're not going to understand your view, because if the community is only just understanding alternative expressions of sexual or of attractions, even, they're not going to understand you. Now they maybe like they need like 10, 15, 20, 50 years to then understand, oh, okay, there's a continuum and it's okay to move within the continuum. So it's almost like we have to wait for the public mass to kind of understand human sexuality to then kind of like get away from the current popular ideology which is in there. And yeah, and I think as people of faith, we we're always told we're backwards, we're conservative, and things like that. And so we always have to kind of be patient and then kind of see where the community is at, whereas what we can then do for people who are coming in and they're wanting for support, because most people know that the narrative is quite political. Mm-hmm.
I think that it's never been, I think I agree in part with what your mom's perspective is. Although I've observed that, so I'm 50.
Mm-hmm.
The gay community that I was a part of that was contending for equality and politically active, I think we hit a pinnacle with the acceptance of gay marriage in the United States. And then from that point, a new generation started moving forward, and they don't have the same points of pain or perspectives that we had. For example, America has never been more accepting of LGBTQ ever than it is now. And yet the LGBTQ community claims that it's never been more suppressed than it is now.
Mm-hmm.
And so, the younger generation has a completely different perspective. And so given that, I want to say that it is extremely important that we all, everyone with our life experience, cast a vision for what is truly beautiful. What does integrity look like in our sexuality? What do we want healthy community to look like? What aspects of family do we want to protect and cherish? What do we want to declare is truly good and beautiful about masculinity and femininity, womanhood and manhood? And start talking about what we see is the ideal and who we want to be as a faith community. Like, we actually do not want to be this bigoted, self-righteous, arrogant, angry community that the LGBTQ claims that they see. Mm. We actually want to be a welcoming community, full of kindness, full of compassion, willing to walk the extra mile together. And so for all of us, your population or mine, your faith background or mine, it's so vital that we all make an assessment of what we're going after. What are our values, and what do we want to see, and start making a stand on that. Because one of the big issues is, who am I now? Who am I really? If I'm not a lesbian and I wasn't born a lesbian, what am I? Am I a woman, and what does that mean? How do I isolate stereotype from reality? And what part of stereotype is to be embraced, and what part of stereotype is to be dismissed? And so it's so vital that the religious community starts to declare the beauty of what we know to be true based on our faith, and make that evident, and then encourage those who are in this journey with us to say, oh, well, you may be lost, you may be struggling, you are trying to let go of something that has been your life experience, but you don't have a vision for what you're trying to reach into. And so providing that vision, providing the words of affirmation that say, yes, you're an incredibly beautiful woman, and this is what I see about you, and being able to create that environment. We're at such a beautiful and important point of time where our world is mostly unknown and mostly undefined. And we're in a position to cast vision for what life should be. What should it be like? And how can we communicate that into the vacuum so that culture doesn't define us? And for many of us who have been in that place of, I don't feel comfortable in myself as a woman and expressing my sexuality from that angle, it's such a relief to be able to say, oh, this is what I believe God has ordained for my life, and I'm going to follow that path until I see it, because God is with me in that journey. And I believe firmly that many, many people who are not of the faith community desire that deeply. Desire the mysterious truth of what it means to be human. And we're all in a position to walk that out with integrity for our cultures.
Mhm. Yeah, no, absolutely. It is that mysteriousness of being in integrity with our Creator, which is beautiful, and which is also what people covet in having that inner peace, that tranquility in our identity. So no, I thought that you put that really beautifully, and you're right, we have almost a responsibility because we're creating a completely new narrative, an unfound narrative, which perhaps isn't understood, and we have responsibility that we we are honest within ourselves, and perhaps we learn from other experiences and say, oh, maybe the messaging of that wasn't right. And I'm personally constantly thinking how to be more transparent, to be accountable, to be truthful, so that so the people that we're helping have the best opportunity and the most clearest view of what the aim is. For example, like we say the aim is God-centricity. The aim isn't sexual orientation change, because what we find is when you do the work, it becomes your personal values and your personal systems and the way you get to it become more important. But we don't understand that until we do the journey itself. We start off the journey by saying it's an SSA issue, and then we end up somewhere where we didn't think that we would be. And you're absolutely right, it is a journey, and it has its mystery. Any closing remarks before we finish?
No, not other than I've just really been pleased to speak to you and to engage these questions and your following. So just thank you again for inviting me. I'm so honored.
Thank you for having us. And for those of you who might also be interested, there's IFTCC conference, which will be happening later in I think it's October this year. And I think is it Ken and yourself? I think both who are attending this year, which would be great. So we look forward to that, and may God bless all of the work that both Ken and yourself are doing at Change. And we hope that God blesses you further in your movement. Thank you everyone for watching today. Our next webinar is the Conversion Therapy Roundtable. So hopefully we see you there. If not, then God bless.
Thank you.